Hi, I'm John Stevens,
This is Matt Russell.
and this is Pod Have Mercy.
This is Pod Have Mercy.
So, hey, we're joined today by our bestest friend in the world, who now lives in Virginia part-time, the doctor, the Reverend Doctor,
The Reverend Doctor.
Cleve Tinsely.
How's it going there?
How's your job at Virginia Union?
Man, things are well. Yeah, as best as they can be. You know, it's still in the middle of a pandemic, so it's not ideal working conditions. But I'm loving the city of Virginia. It's on a nice little grid. The people are nice, and Virginia Union actually is a great place to be right now. So things are going well. Just a little busy right now.
Well, they're lucky to have you. I know that.
Are you liking it?
I am. I'm liking it so far. There doesn't come without some challenges on the administrative side. You know, you got to raise money and do things like that. But things are good. Overall, things are wonderful. I couldn't have asked for a better position.
That's awesome. So a couple of things I thought we'd talk about today. One has to do with, something that just, what was a little thing that happened? It was what was they called it on Saturday Night Live? Old man contest. The country got to vote on, there were two old men kind of in a contest, and we got to vote on which old man we wanted over the other old man, and all that happened. But I didn't think, I don't know necessarily with all things shaking out and causing anxiety for us in our lives or anyone else's lives, but I was confronted. I was struck by a quote that I saw. Andy Stanley, who is a pastor in Atlanta at North Point, wrote this thing leading up to the election about, your political candidate's going to win or lose based on how people vote, Americans vote. But he was really more concerned about how the church wins or loses, and how in some way our nation wins or loses based on how Christians love each other. And that's why Jesus said we must not allow anything or anyone to divide us as we consider any candidates, any policies, any direction. The one question that Christians must not neglect in their decision making is, what does love require of us? And so while we disagree politically, we must love unconditionally, praying for unity. Fear should not fuel our actions. Love is the power we need. Love must fuel both conversation and choice. And I guess he ends it by saying, if the church is going to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ, the church and Christians have to ask ourselves, are we willing to humble ourselves and love one another and seek unity on love? And I guess I thought we'd talk a little bit here at the beginning just about what is the church's response? Theologically, what is a Christian's response in the light of an election? And I'll say something Matt and I talked about at lunch. We watched Saturday Night Live, and I thought Dave Chappelle at the beginning said something that I thought really struck me. He said, how you felt 4 years ago. He was talking, I think, more to a Democratic audience. He said, how you felt 4 years ago. He said, just keep in mind that, how did he say, half the country feels the same way today. And
then he said, the difference between us, that is, I don't hate those people. I hate that feeling, right? And that thing that divides us, that thing that makes power move in ways that is nefarious and others and blocks out. And I thought his comment was.
Yeah, so I thought it'd be good for all of us just to talk a little bit about it as leaders among Christians, as leaders in our different spaces where we find ourselves. But really, as faith leaders, intellectual leaders, you now are influencing a whole generation of young people at Virginia Union. How do we help people process and think through about what it means to be followers of Christ in the light of the days that we find ourselves? What is the church's response? What is a Christian's response to this, no matter which side you're on? I think it's something I continue to wrestle with and ask myself about as I try to lead people in a church.
Yeah. I've given 2 or 3 thoughts to some of the things you said, John. First about the Christian message of unity, and we have the tendency. I've said this to another colleague, another ministerial colleague, who sent me a text about it. And I said we have the tendency. We have to be careful, especially as practitioners, because we have a tendency to want to live in abstractions, right? We want to say love, unity, and these things, and oftentimes we don't connect that to the implications of what that love is, right? Mm-hmm. Cornel West is a philosopher famous for saying justice is what love looks like in public. And so there's a way we got to press our languages to translate into practice and what that means. And so I think, yes, there needs to be theological analysis, but I also think we need to do more internal, not only sociological, but practical analysis about how our ideals connect to our practices. Interestingly, I was doing some reading preparing for something else today, and I read this thought from a guy who talked about how positionality is always determined by discourse, or meaning we've situated in discourse worlds, and as soon as we sort of violate the parameters of this discourse, depending on where you are in the schema of that discourse, is how the kind of violence of oppressions tends to hit you. What does that mean for us? What that means is like, we have to figure out in whatever sphere we are, be it Christian, be it academic, be it otherwise, how we're positioned within discourse strategies, meaning as religious leaders, me, you, and Matt are able to kind of stand, and part of the huge responsibility we have is to translate discourse into action for people. And we have to recognize that in what ways do we participate in instruction in these discourse strategies that either liberate people or kind of serve for their oppression. So I read an article today, a journal article today about, because the Democrats now are crying out, say, hey, we need to come together in unity. The question I have is unity necessarily the goal here, or is it liberty? Is it freedom, right? Because where liberty is, then, one finds true freedom. But to really liberate other folks means doing the difficult work of disentangling and demystifying some of our discourse. So what I appreciate, Andrew Stanley, I wonder sometimes, what does that mean though, right? So we have to ask difficult questions and ask like, okay, if we can agree that love is the right way and justice is the right call, to be humble, do justly, and to love God, what does that mean? And how is that implicated in the policies that we stand for? Why is it that I am, if I'm just going to use myself, why is it I consign myself to being a capitalist over against this or that, right? So I think what we need to do as a church and church leaders is to try to cultivate spaces where we're able to have, and I talked about this in the past, why do we not cultivate spaces where we're able to have more sincere conversations and not just gloss over stuff? We get the kind of framework that we're supposed to kind of stand from. But I think what is incumbent upon us as leaders now is to do a bit more, right? Is to take the kind of theoretical framework that we say we agree upon, unity, justice, and love, and talk about how that translates in the space and what that means in the social worlds we occupy. And a ministerial alliance reached out to me asking about it. And I said, look, on the one hand, what does this context show? It shows us that the country is more divided than ever, regionally and nationally. But also, like, unless we're willing to take it a step further and do, I don't know, whether it's some anonymous polling or whatever, within our own context, us as we practice in UMCs, about why it is we agree with one particular political candidate over and against the other, what it is about the policy, and how do we feel that aligns with our theology of what we believe is right in this world. Unless we're able to have broader and deeper conversations, but also more than that, come to terms with these disagreements, then we're always going to continue to be at stalemates, right? Because we can all say, it's easy for us to say, hey, we may have a disagreement, but the only thing that matters is we come together and we're about creating justice in the world, or we're about loving our neighbor. But unless we talk about what that love looks like, I think we're always going to be at these moments where it's hard for us to kind of get past talking past one another. And I think what this political season shows, and the way that we see, whether it's selfishness or whether it's a kind of dogmatic view on the one end or both ends not being able to talk with one another is because like we've become so concerned about our positionality and where we are in that practice. And what we see is that discourses are used against us now. And so whether it's the far left or the far right, if you want to talk about it politically, there are ways in which we can use discourse to serve our own ends easily in a way that seems right with us. But it's hard for us to kind of create a congenial space where we're able to exchange. And that's always been both my struggle and challenge to myself and others who are religious practitioners is how can we create space where we can have, we call it critical, but no, how can we create space where we can have more honest dialogue with each other? To where one's authority within the discourse structure doesn't feel so threatened that I got to kill them now, if that makes sense, right? And I think that's the challenge I think we are. But again, I'm just open into listening to these conversations because I'm giving it a lot of thought right now.
No, I can appreciate the abstract versus the specific. And when I hear you talk, I think incarnational. I think how do you give flesh to the ideas? Because I do think the safer route for me as a pastor with a diverse congregation is to stay in the realm of transcendence, and so when someone says, oh, you're politically centrist and there's no such thing as centrism, and I say, no, it's political transcendence, it's above it all. Well, that's very holy sounding. I know that. That's why I use it. But I mean, like you said, it's about love and unity and mercy and forgiveness and reconciliation. But I do think you're right. I think at some point, we have to make a move as to what does that look like? What does that look like in relationships in real time? What does it look like? Because I think Christians are not absent in the world. We're in the world, but not of the world. But being in the world is significant.
Yeah.
I mean, it means something.
Or at least I give more thought to what we're saying. We're in the world, but not of the world. What does that mean? Like we're fundamentally then should be rooted against the things that serve to degrade or dismantle the livelihood of others. It's not just about my well-being, right? So to be not of the world means, at least as our understanding, to be not like folks who by nature, right, want to make sure I get ahead at the expense of others. So in my opinion, this is just Cleve speaking, I'm not speaking for anybody else. I fundamentally got a problem with children being detained at a border and separated from their family and nobody giving a damn about that. Like, I just fundamentally think that that's a kind of ethical and moral imperative that I think we as Christians should say that's fundamentally wrong, right? So I'm saying, what I'm saying is at some point we got to talk about some specifics and say, so what are the problems here, right? Also, I think it's fundamentally wrong for a centrist to say, well, my appeal is to make sure that all the middle class has this. What about the kind of predilection for the poor that we as ministers stand up and talk about all the time, right? So at some point we got to be able to, I guess, give more critical eyes on ourselves as those of us who move in a kind of middle brow existence. What does it mean for us to be who we are, to dwell in the places we are, to speak authoritatively with the discourse power that we've been given? And what real difference are we making in the world, right? Are we trying to just really foster a social club that makes sure everything's okay? Or am I really trying to make a real difference in the world? I think that's the challenge we all have as institutional leaders. I have it here as well, because at the bottom, we can't help. We're confined by a capitalistic structure, which means we have to make decisions sometimes that's about bottom line and survival and about succeeding in it. At the same time, we've been given this vision of otherworldliness, right? Being not of this world that says, no, it's our job to figure out approaches to make this stuff work for the good of everybody who's within the sphere of the influence of this institution to make that work. How do we do that? These are questions I think that are age old to answer. Yeah. And I think what this election does is just allow all of us to look at ourselves and say, what are we doing? What is there really is causing the division here? Because at this point, it's not just about evangelical Christians. It's not about this. I mean, there are deep racial, socioeconomic divides here. And what's being kind of stirred here, right? What is my allegiance to whatever being stirred by? These are just larger questions we have to have. And why is it so acrimonious right now? Is that how this thing's supposed to be? And so these are just deeper questions I'm asking personally about what it means for us. And if my calling doesn't allow me to be effective in some kind of way, at least speaking to folks who have questions about that, then I just need to think about and kind of reorient my practice as well. So all that to say, man, I think these are difficult times, but at the same time, these are times that really call us to do some more self-scrutiny about who we are, where we are, and what we're called to do.
Yeah, I think we talked about this too, I think, a little bit at lunch about the church's struggle. My experience has been in serving predominantly white, upper to middle class churches. They're diverse on some what I would call political or theological concerns, but there's not other diversity, but there's diversity there within certain realms. But I've had people now who are on the conservative side who say, I'm thinking about leaving this church because you're not adamantly speaking definitively about these issues that I feel are important for me in my life that I also think are tied to my faith, whether it's abortion or liberty or just any number of issues that would be on that side. We also have people on the left who are leaving the church and are disenfranchised and say, you're not speaking specifically enough about the things you said, about justice, about racial reconciliation. You know, we're doling out our small amounts, but we're not really seeking to change society. And so I think the struggle is on the one side, you know, you've got people in the middle that, like you said, that the abstract is a safe space because it leaves some things open to interpretation. And so I've always kind of maybe justified it wrong or right. I don't know, in the sense that I use some of the abstract to try to keep us all on the same plane. But then when we go out and we do work in the world, there is a very tangible, specific element to how we do what we do. And we don't hide the fact that, you know, you're down advocating for rent relief, or that we're, you know, 13% of all the food distribution going out in 18 counties is going from our food pantry, or whatever it is. And some people say, like, oh, well, you're just pointing to those things that you do, but that's the real action. That's the real work that happens. And, you know, I do think it's a big shift happening in society. And I think we are becoming, as I shared with you, a lot more assertive and confident and versus where we used to be, where we were very careful to try to negotiate all the sides. And now I find myself in pandemic mode and post-secularism and all these things that we find ourselves, where it's like when someone comes and they throw down the gauntlet and I'm like, okay, fine, there's a church for you. Maybe this is not it. And so I think we're making the move to that. I just want to be really careful that I'm not overlaying sort of my personal self-interest with transcendent, biblical, loving, merciful, reconciliation. Because I'm with you. I mean, you can have, I think, on some people they fall into a very legalistic way of interpreting their faith,
right,
and a legalistic way of interpreting things. Like, these people come across the border illegally, they don't have any rights, blah, blah, blah. That way anything goes. But I don't care if you even believe that. And even if that's true, the fact that a child would be torn from the mother, and they would say, well, we do it in this country. If a woman's arrested, she doesn't have her child. You know, they make us like, it doesn't matter. It's wrong in any sense of wherever it happens. If it doesn't break your heart, it kind of makes me wonder if there's a heart in there, I guess, is the fact. I don't know. It's a struggle.
It is. And I mean, I'll be honest with you. I tell all my clergy friends, I say, man, you know, I wouldn't want to be here right now. Like I said, there's a reason why I think I'm not institutionally as a church as a pastor right now, because these are difficult times, right? Like, especially given not only the variety of not only perspectives, but I think fundamentally the ability to ask questions about just what's the merciful way here? Meaning, regardless of what one feels about policy or whatever, just fundamentally, how can I maintain the integrity of another human, right? For me, sometimes, for me, it just boils down to like that. Like, how do I maintain the integrity of another human I see, regardless of where they come from or how they got here in front of me right now?
That's right.
Right. And if we get these base fundamental questions, right? So then we got to ask, like, so what does the life of faith do for us? What is it meant to do for us? And people have different answers to those questions. And I just think, because myself, I was formed in a conservative Black evangelical tradition. And I just found more, not as an intellectual type of like growth, I just found that the more and more I just try to deeply become human, the more some of these kind of strict dogmatisms I had about faith or about what a person should do in their own lives began to kind of become subverted by a more fundamental concern about how, like the Bible just says, how would I want to be treated if I were this other person, right? And so it's rough, and I often that in our consulting practice, we often tell folks, now listen, we're not here to tell you exactly what to do in this instance. You have to gauge the temperature of where your congregation or your institution is. All we can do is just provide a set of tools about what it means to think about these things, but you have to be recognized. Where's your board willing to go? Where's your constituent ready to go? What loss are you willing to kind of endure? And then also back up and say, well, and just recognize where you are in that. I just think it's incumbent upon us now to recognize, who are we in this moment? What stances do I think are foundational for me to be a moral and ethical person who moves about in this world? How can I be a person of integrity, meaning who I am in front of people is who I am behind closed doors when it's just me and Matt, right? These are just fundamental questions we ask, like, who am I when I'm with every other audience? Mm-hmm. And if over time one is forced to, dissemble oneself, right, based on where they are, that's when I think those are moments where you have the opportunity to grow and say, no, I really want to be consistent with the kind of personality who I'm trying to form myself to be. I think that's where growth happens. But spurring these conversations, what I'm seeing now happening in churches especially is folks are like trying to have the conversations, right? I think now the struggle and tension is, how do I move from these conversations to kind of being, figuring out what to do, and am I willing to kind of take that step? Because the truth of the matter is, I think what these moments sometimes require us to do really requires not only a deep disorientation personally, but it's really going to require restructuring. Think about Jesus's life. I mean, the synagogue leaders didn't necessarily love Jesus in his prophetic ministry and what Jesus, because he fundamentally was like, the religious authorities fundamentally was against the movement of Jesus. In fact, it's the reason why Jesus got crucified. And so we have to ask ourselves as institution leaders, is what does that mean for us now in this institution? I don't have the answers. I'm just thinking out loud with you guys.
No. That's what I'm doing. I'm thinking out loud.
Yeah, and I think through, think about that institutions are to serve people, right? They're to be those institutions that create space for that kind of rich dialogue, that rich coming together, and the protection of what its mission is to serve the broader kind of human struggle, right? And so when institutions flip and ask folks to serve that for some kind of stability that it can't bring, it ends up ripping us apart, I think, When I was noted that Rabbi Jonathan Sacks died this week. He's, besides Jesus, he's probably one of my favorite rabbis of all time. And he told a story one time, which is apocryphal, but where Moses is coming across, and all the children of Israel were let out, right? And the sea opens up, and all the children of Israel run across to the other side, and then the sea closes back up, and Moses turns to the children of Israel, and they're just dancing and partying and just going crazy. And he turns to Yahweh, and Yahweh has his back turns on the children of Israel and is weeping. And Moses says, God, why are you crying? And he says, because my children are drowning in the sea, right? And I think there's so much of what we've done in our country, which is to create an either or, that we no longer can, as Ruby Sales says, we no longer can be led to each other's pain that's behind all the discourses. And I think part of what we have to do as a church, and partly what we have to do as ministers of the faith, is to understand the discourses, but to be led to the pain underneath the discourses, so that we can really enact what is really, I think, at the heart of all of us, is deeper longing to be healed, to be made whole, to be saved. That's the root word of that word anyway, right? And not to make it a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
Well, that opens the door. How much time we got, Jeff?
We're at 30 minutes on the dot right now.
You want to keep going, or you want to? What you want to do?
We can do probably 10 more minutes if you have another topic, but
I'm good.
30's nice.
I mean, 30's always nice. 30 minutes is always nice. Well, all right. So just from my own knowledge, and for you, Cleve, to weigh in on this. So the United Methodist Church just had a gathering, which usually means not a lot was accomplished, and probably more meetings were scheduled. That's usually what that means. But the bishops put out something, and it was very confusing to me, and maybe because I'm just not very smart, but I was wondering if you might just help me like with language here. So the bishops met, and what they did a bunch of different things about a bunch of different things that no one really cares about. But they also came out with something that they said they approved 4 pillars that they would like to focus on in the church's anti-racism work. All right, so let me read you these 4, and let me get your thoughts on this. The number 1, creating space for narratives of integrity and truth while resisting narratives of fear and division or othering. I'm kind of wishing that they'd expanded more on some of these. I don't really know what that means. Creating spaces for narratives of integrity and truth while resisting narratives of fear and division or othering. Is that just honest dialogue? Is that what they mean? Listening to each other?
A long sentence for just saying, let's create spaces where we can have respect for dialogue, basically.
Then they said moving toward...
We want people to have integrity and to speak in their truth. We also don't want people to get mad and stoke further division. So all they're saying, look, let's create spaces where we can have respect for dialogue, basically.
Okay.
Is that also too?
That sounds like, can't we just all get along? It's like,
Yeah.
I mean, doesn't it? It's just like, hey, you listen to me, I listen to you. You don't stoke fear, I won't stoke fear. I mean, dude, our country is excellent at stoking fear. This is what we do. We get A+ in stoking fear.
We export it.
This is what we do. And then the second one was moving toward pain, injury, and harm. And you had to help me with that one, because I always thought, why would I want to move toward pain, injury, and harm? But you're saying being drawn to where there is pain, injury, and harm,
Yeah,
right?
I think this is like the call to move towards the margins, the call of widow, orphan, stranger. Where is that? Because we know that in pain, injury, and harm, there's a deep need for healing, and that's usually the place where the Spirit shows up and does a lot of work. Calls us to move into that direction. I think also that it dismantles some of the narrative. This kind of narrative of left to right and up is the narrative to be joined to, and that we see a lot of, folks that are beginning to talk about kind of alternative history than the one that is taught. The one that's kind of brought out and amplified to say, actually, there's a multiple histories of folks that within the United States that have suffered and painfully and continue to be a part of that oppression that we need to move towards. And I think our salvation, our wholeness as a nation, is caught up in our ability to do that as people that are privileged and credentialed.
So I think that's a rather charitable read. I mean, I'm willing to grant that, but I think you're reading a lot more than what I see, right? Because I think
there's only 5 words
right.
there.
I would think that's what it means. But as it stated, it just says moving toward pain, injury, and harm. But John said, there's not much explication about what that means
true.
exactly.
Come on, Professor. Teach us what should it say?
On the one hand, I mean, I think just reading it at face value could mean, hey, let's be more engaged with trauma porn on the one hand, right? Or it could just say, let's, like what Matt is saying, move into these zones for the purposes of trying to address some of that, right? But how it's left right now is kind of truncated. We don't know what that means. It could just mean more listening sessions. And so I wish, it would have been more explicit in that.
Yeah,
right?
they need need a better PR person on a press release, because this, and I even went to the press release down below and I clicked on it to get like the fuller thing, and this is just all they had with these 4 points.
This is the fullest thing.
Yeah, this was
got.
it. So they have it. So
you get enough bishops together with all theology degrees, and this is the best.
So
they got.
I think you're right. I think there's going to probably be a commission formed for each one of these 4 pillars that are going to. I mean, that's just the Methodist way of doing things.
Right. You're right.
And then nothing.
Just for y'all, you sent it to me earlier. The next one, a willingness to be discomforted in order to be faithful witnesses, and for living as people of relentless hope. But in none of that does it mean I'm addressing shit. I'm sorry for the audience, boot that out. None of that says I'm addressing it, right? It just says I'm gonna listen. I'm gonna be a little uncomfortable, and I'm going back to my church and do my thing.
And I'm gonna live with hope, which means what?
Yeah, and look, and I'm just gonna hope it all improves better.
It all gets
Jesus
better.
is coming eventually.
But like we talked about before, we love these. I love these abstract words. Relentless hope. Relentless hope. I can preach that. Relentless hope, and they get a tear in my eye. We're gonna get up, walk out with relentless hope.
It doesn't cost us anything.
But exactly, I don't have to do anything with this, though, right? I really don't have to do anything with this. I just got to have a couple of what they might call courageous conversations for a while until this moment passes, and then we go back to the status quo, right? So I'm interested to see what comes out. That's really interesting.
Even like number 3, this willingness to be discomforted in order to be a faithful witness, as if your ability your ability to be discomforted.
A faithful witness to my discourse, though, right?
Yes, right. To who?
Right? I'm going to listen, not to really hear you. I'm going to listen so I can be a better witness so you can get transformed and see where I am.
But also, it also means if I just feel discomforted, I've been a faithful witness. It doesn't mean I have to change.
Right.
It doesn't mean I have to do anything about that. You know what? If that's the case, then your friendship has made me the most faithful witness on the planet.
You are the most faithful witness in the world.
Yeah, I'm hopeful. I am relentlessly hopeful that maybe they'll add more to this. My 4th pillar. I'm going to stand on the 4th pillar, and maybe they'll. I mean, I've been a Methodist pastor now for 30 years, and I can tell you that probably what's going to happen is they'll have commissions and they'll appoint people and they'll do documents and they'll bring it to things. There'll be all these words on a page, and they might even come out with a study guide.
Yes.
There may be a study guide. And probably nowadays, since we're in the 21st century, it could be a video, a DVD, although it probably now will have an option to download it online.
Wow.
So we could get that.
We could get that.
Yeah, and then a couple of churches will buy it. They might use it, and then it'll end up in the church library, which will be the eternal record of all of these things we've studied.
Yes. Which is so interesting, and that's why when folks say they don't come to church because the church is answering questions that nobody's asking. When the whole culture is being torn up, we can't even be definitive with our language in terms of this is about anti-racism. Right? And this is where I get a little frustrated saying, we have basically the founder of our faith is a person of color. We can do better than this, folks.
Well, it was interesting because when I just read that, I read the press release about some other things, and I read this. I thought, they're going to make as a central part of their whole focus anti-racism. And then I read these 4 pillars, and I know, I'm learning a lot from you guys and the work that you're doing in Curate and in the community. I'm just really trying to listen and learn. But I mean, I certainly am not anywhere close to knowing as much as I should know about this, but I read this and I didn't even know what this stuff meant. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? I just,
I mean, it start me and when I first met when me and Matt first started. I told him in the beginning probably what's going to be most disorienting, Matt, and if nothing else, I think the whole reason why I started engaging in any kind of critical study is like unless you're willing to do what I started in the beginning, unless we're able to really critically look at how our discourse plays into the further oppression of folk who our systems kind of suppress. And that's it. So the first thing we started doing, man, was challenging. I mean, same thing, just even at the image of Jesus, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Matt remembers the first thing we began to do is break down these terms, like what do we mean when we say reconciliation? What do we mean when we say justice, right?
Yes.
It's one thing to say terms, but honestly, we use words so sloppily nowadays. We don't really know what we mean when we say them, right?
Yes.
So I think sometimes if we can just take more time in our sermons, even being more thoughtful about how we use words, and let's not presume, right? We have the same kind of understandings of these terms, because oftentimes we do. And what I've just learned is we just back up and say, well, what do you mean by that, right?
Mm.
What do we mean when we say this? When we say the kingdom, right? The kingdom, right? What do we mean about neighbor, right? Just these basic terms we use, we don't ask ourselves enough questions. And I don't think we really interrogate both biblical narrative and text along with tradition and the social cultural history of what was going on. We miss a lot of these larger lessons, right? We got to do more investigation of these texts about why did Jesus call the woman a dog and Samaritan about pointing to their people, and what implications does that have for today and for us, right? So like there's so many questions we can ask, even of just the text that we read on Sundays. Different perspectives we can bring about that I think could in themselves make us better followers of Jesus's way, which was about love, mercy, and justice as far as I understand it. For me, from my perspective now, if there's any kind of dogmatism or idea or creed that causes me to devalue someone else, right? And that's something I got to scrutinize further and see if it's worth me holding on to, right?
Yeah, amen. It reminds me, last thing I think we can say when we end here, but I can't remember who, if it was Fred Craddock, one of my professors, and he used to say, when you preach a sermon, at the end of the sermon, when you walk away, the question that the preacher should ask, what difference did this make?
Good.
What difference does it make that I know this? What difference does it make that I preach this sermon? And I think that what you're talking about is the work that we have to do to move from sort of theory to practice or belief to practice, the orthodoxy to the orthopraxy. Mm-hmm. And so what does it look like? And it's very easy. It's easy to stay in orthodoxy. And it's why we have so many people that are focused on that, right thinking.
Mm-hmm. You don't need people.
Because you don't have to live that. You don't have to live right thinking. You don't have to be in relationships with people with right thinking. So, man, listen, we are praying for you up there, and you look like you're doing great. I like your apartment.
And I appreciate your prayers, man. Continue to pray for me. I mean, don't get me, on the one hand, things are great, but always there's a struggle to find the balance. And so I'm saying at the beginning of everything, you want to make sure that, like, am I at the place where the movement of the Spirit continues to do things? And so it takes usually a year or two to do that kind of stuff. And I'm just at the point in my life now, I tell Matt this all the time, I've been involved on the bottom floor of so many movements. I'm tired of starting from scratch, right? So I need God to work it a little faster. Make my adjustment period in about 3 months, okay?
All right, so that'll be our prayer, that you go from like the
basement
month 1 to year 1 as quickly as possible.
Month 1 to year 10 in 3 months.
Yeah.
I need to do,
Man, we love you. I'm looking forward to seeing you when you get back in town.
Yeah, miss you guys too, man. Look forward to seeing you guys too.
All right.
We'll be getting together.
Thanks, Cleve.
That'd be great. See
you.
you.
Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.
It's always great talking with Cleve because his perspective seems to kind of pull at the edges of my own understanding and broaden me. I had the tendency to kind of focus too tightly on some things, and he, like any good prophet, pulls those edges apart, and I go, okay, that's what it means to live more fully human in this life. So
I just think he has a real gift that if you're willing to listen, no matter where you are, especially I think in my context as a white man, and I'm thinking about all the racial recalibration and struggles in society, I want to understand, I want to listen, but sometimes I hear voices and things that strike me in a way that makes me very angry or defensive.
yeah, you're right.
But he's got this invitational way that invites me into space, and I don't feel threatened by him, but I feel challenged.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. I felt
And
like
I think
that.
that's a great gift that he has.
It is.
And I think that that it's incumbent upon all of us to listen to each other.
Yeah.
And I think he also listens, which one I appreciate about him.
He does. I love that, what he was talking about, that the cultivation of that space where we can really have a different kind of dialogue. We all say we want that, but cultivating that space to where it's not, if I agree with you, I'll stay. If I don't, I'm going to go. But it's saying, no, you're my brother, you're my sister. This is what it means to work out our faith with fear and trembling, and we have to continue to cultivate that.
Good podcast. I'm John Stevens.
And I'm Matt Russell.
And this is Pod Have Mercy.